Hello friends, this is Jim with Science Talk. In this report I'm going to share with you what's happening with relation to our food supplies, our food stocks, as the planet continues to warm. I've done reports of this before. Here's another estimation, another report, an update if you will. Heat extremes harm harvests, so do floods, drought, high winds. Climate change spurs food shocks that threaten, people being able to put food on the table. The people who think, warmer planet means plants are going to love it and they're going to, keep on growing and all that kind of great stuff. Well, no. Plants, like any other organisms, have a preferred temperature range. For a lot of the plants that are commercially important to humans, when you start getting above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, plants don't like it. About the only exception is corn. Corn tends to be a C4 plant, which is a type of metabolism that utilizes that does well in arid conditions, but most plants are C3. And the C3 plants prefer moist areas and lower temperatures. So increasing the temperatures is going to stress out most of the commercially important plant species. And I've also done reports where studies have shown that the yields do decrease with higher temperatures, as well as the nutritional value. So we're seeing with the predictions that food shocks are becoming and will become even more frequent. Potatoes are basically literally being baked potatoes out in the field. Corn likes arid conditions. Even the corn is being affected by drought and parched, in essence. Fruit is being affected by, surprisingly, frost because of the crazy swings, with the jet streams dipping down, the polar vortex, and so on. So you have the crazy extremes in temperature, and that's going to frostbite the fruit. A long-term study suggests that for the world's farmers, graziers, fishing crews, fish farmers, things will get worse as the world warms. Australian and U.S. scientists report in the journal Nature Sustainability. They examined the incidence of what they call food shocks across 134 nations over a period of 53 years. This is a very extensive, well-done, meticulous study. They found that some regions and some kinds of farming have suffered worse than others. Food production is vulnerable to volatile climate and weather changes, and the dangers are increasing with time. The researchers looked at cases of dramatic crop failure, harvest loss, fishing fleet failures between 1961 and 2013, as recorded by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And they also use other sources, and then they mapped the shock frequency and co-occurrence. In their database of 741 available time series of food production, they found 226 cases of food shock, which is defined as dramatic interruption of supply. So this, this is basically something like about a 28% rate of food shock based on their data. I'm trying to do some quick math in my head. So, agriculture, livestock came out of this as slightly more vulnerable to shock than fisheries and aquaculture. The point is, hunger will increase as a result. South Asia suffered most from crop damage or loss, the Caribbean for livestock, Eastern Europe for fisheries. Some of these regions were hard hit in more than one sector. The frequency of shocks has increased across all sectors and at a global scale. This is what the authors state. Increasing shock frequency is a food security concern in itself. Conflict-related shocks across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East since 2010, combined with adverse climate conditions, are responsible for the first uptick in global hunger in recent times. So not only is there the issue of what climate change is doing to even grow or raise the food, you start throwing in human conflicts, and that just exacerbates the situation. More than half of all shocks to food production were climate related, and drought was the biggest factor. You have seen me do reports before you earlier where I discussed how wet areas become wetter, dry areas become drier. Extreme weather accounted for a quarter of shocks to livestock and disease outbreaks, another 10%, but the biggest single factor for pastoral farmers arose from geopolitical conflict and other crises. So that comes back into the wars, etc., which will impact. But then what happens? You then create climate refugees. These people start trying to relocate, and that puts pressure on other governments, and then also on the resources. And you can see how the situation just kind of gets out of hand. Fisheries seem better protected, and the worst shocks to fish landings could be traced to overfishing. Disruption to fish farming, which is a relatively new form of food production, has grown at a faster rate and to a higher level than in any other sector. Now, the biggest issue with aquaculture practices is controlling disease organisms, especially if you have a closed system where you get a disease organism in the system and it could just wipe out everything. If you have some like open water farming, like the oysters in the Chesapeake, you still have the issue of disease, but it's open, but the water be flushed out. The problem then becomes warmer waters. The disease vectors might be able to more readily survive, infecting the food supply, causing problems. Climate scientists and agricultural researchers have been warning for years that food security is at hazard from global warming and climate change. Okay. And as I stated before, the increased temperatures, the crop yields decrease, nutritional values also decrease. Heat extremes can harm cereal yields almost anywhere, but Africa and Southeast Asia are particularly at risk from changes in precipitation patterns. This latest study is a reminder that in some ways the future is here. The forewarned rise in climate extremes, flood, heat, drought is here. And now, yes, we have the geopolitical issues that can create food shocks, but climate change is now increasingly a factor. So, there was a second study for the UN Security Council that happened to have been released on the same day as the study I just shared with you. Hunger and conflict on a persistent and deadly partnership that threatens millions. So it's possible to end up with mass famine. The number of food shocks fluctuates from year to year. The Nature Sustainability authors say that is because factors such as social conflict and climate change can, in synergy, create a number of shocks across different sectors at different times. At least 22 of the 134 nations experienced shocks in many sectors over the same 5-year time period. Some cases, these shocks ended with more than just empty shelves. The collapse of the Soviet Union late in the last century removed some economic support from North Korea. Subsequent floods precipitated a famine that killed nearly 200,000 people. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1991 and the subsequent First Gulf War devastated agricultural land and cost Kuwaitis, commercial fishermen, their livelihoods. Drought in Afghanistan 2001 and 2002 decimated cereal yields. Pastoralists lost fodder for their cattle, and animal disease incidents increased dramatically. While the number of food shocks fluctuates from year to year, the long-term trend shows they are happening more often. This is a statement by Richard Cottrell of the University of Tasmania, who was the lead author and the lead researcher. And I have discussed this gentleman, mentioned him before in previous reports. He states that globalized trade and the dependence of many countries on food imports mean that food shocks are a global problem, and the international community faces a significant challenge to build resistance. So, as I stated to you guys before, we have an ever-increasing population of people. There's a finite land area. You have to set aside land to house people, set aside land to conduct business, set aside land to grow food. Ever-increasing population puts massive stress, massive strain on the system. To be blunt, it is not sustainable. Something has to give. And what's going to give is you're going to either have a pandemic run through the human population, you're going to have mass famine, starvation, these kind of things. Fighting over the dwindling resources will lead to wars, and wars, of course, result in many, many deaths. So, I hate to put it in such terms, but there will have to be a corrective factor taking place, meaning that something's going to happen to reduce human population. Could be humans doing it to themselves, could be nature doing something to us. And we're already seeing that what our actions are doing is impacting what's happening in nature, which is going to come back and bite us in the ass. And it's now happening. So I am not optimistic. You know, if I was to give my objective assessment, my opinion based on the data, I am not optimistic that humans are going to come out of this, to be quite blunt. I mean, planet Earth will be fine. You know, humans will go extinct. Evolution will continue. Earth will go around the sun for 5 billion more years until the sun expands, swallows up Earth. Earth may get very, very warm, as it has been in the past. It's just too warm for humans to survive, and that's where the planet's heading. So, disturbing reports, but I can't say that it is surprising. As I said, you've heard me discuss with you guys before that the issue of dwindling resources for an ever-growing human population. The lines are never going to intersect. Thank you for your time. Hey friends, this is Jim reminding you to subscribe and share my videos. Also, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I drop a video in. And I'm also asking for you to please support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your continued support.